Hello and welcome to the Hope25 Podcast. I'm your host for today, Michael Calder. Earlier on, I had the chance to catch up with Mark Mcrindle. Mark is a social researcher, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about Australian culture and about Australians' attitudes towards Christianity and towards the hope of Jesus. As we think about how we can share the hope of Jesus, I found this conversation extremely encouraging and also challenging. I hope that you do too. Mark Mcrindle, thank you so much for joining us on the Hope25 podcast. Mark, do you mind just telling us a little bit about who you are and what you get up to?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Great to be with you. I'm a social researcher by profession, so that involves me looking at lots of data sets, demographics being a foundation form, but we also conduct a lot of surveys, and so we look at that quantitative data in that sense, a lot of in-depth interviews and focus groups. That gives us the qualitative state of what's happening, and then we apply that to help organisations and agencies understand just the changing context in which they're operating and how they can better engage and connect and indeed prepare for the trends that are coming their way.
Amazing. So I love data and I love analytics, yeah. So you're tickling something in me.
Well, it's important, because we're in fast-changing times, and I think it's that data that helps us understand the context, not what we had, but what we have. And some of the patterns give us a little indication you can extrapolate forward to get a sense as to where we're going. And I think that's important for all leaders to understand.
Yeah, well, looking forward to what you have to share with us today. Mark, in the past, people have seen Australia as the lucky country with a she'll be right attitude, with a fairly positive outlook on life. Is this still the case in 2024?
Well, there's still that sense as we look at this island continent that we seem to escape the worst of what we see in other parts of the world. And so, that sense of life down under here being a lot more easygoing than other parts of the world is something that Australians feel. There is a great sense that, we are in the luckiest place around, but that doesn't mean that there's not anxiety. In fact, we've been tracking in our research this rise in uncertainty in Australians, and whether that be the economic times or just some uncertainty around the future, geopolitically, or maybe as they think through their children and their future. For some, it's just their own loneliness and not getting that same sense of social integration and connection. Even the data bears this out. The number one long-term health condition, as picked up in the most recent census, showed that it was mental health above any other health condition was the most prevalent. And we just finished a study of teachers asking them about the future of education and what their students are facing. And the number one challenge they said that they see students facing today is really student well-being was the category. A challenge for students around their own sense of ability to handle the uncertainty and the anxiety of their world. So, yeah, there's a lot of data indicating this sense that we're not as laid back as once we were.
Yeah, interesting. So, Mark, at the moment, specifically with where we're facing rising costs of living, we're facing a housing market that's pricing young Australians out, we're facing loneliness, where I'm in Brisbane, rising youth crime. What impact is that having on the mood of Australians?
Well, it's certainly got us into a more subdued mood. Australians tend to just get on and get it done. We're not a particularly reflective people. We tend to focus on the now and not particularly compare how it was or indeed worry too much about what's to come. But that's changed. There is a sense that maybe we've passed the peak of what we had. Certainly we find this with parents, and they say, well, boy, it's tough for kids today, or I'm glad I'm not growing up today. And that can be anything that clouds that, from, say, even the use of technology, which normally, Australians are early adopters of technology. We've always loved the technology of our world, seen the benefits of it. But now, certainly as they look at screens, they say it's perhaps more negative than it is positive for their children. There's concerns around AI, again, a new emerging technology that might offer great productivity and ability to remove more drudgery and create more flourishing communities, and yet there's a pessimism there. And so that tells us something of the recent experience of technology. But it's true, as you mentioned, Michael, in the financial side, where there's a sense that Aussie dream of home ownership is fading for many and harder, if even able to be attained. A sense as to how we're travelling as a community, that there's not that same social belonging and connection. There's more mobility in terms of where we live and less cohesion, and this plays on the minds of Australians. And so that sense, you mentioned crime, that we're not as safe as once we were. Now there's a lot of data to suggest that certainly violent crime is on the decline, but nonetheless there's a sentiment, there's a feeling that things aren't as good as once they were, that communities aren't as cohesive as once they were, and that the pathway for the next generation isn't as positive as the one that went before. So, that's quite a challenge for a society to live in almost the afterglow of what was this great and lucky experience of living in Australia.
Yeah, so as an Anglican church, we're looking to share hope. What opportunity do you think this cultural moment gives the church to share hope right now?
Well, it helps us, I think, to turn the attention from all of these issues on which Australians are fixated and say, well, if we're placing our hope in the financial abilities to buy a home, if our hope is in a sense of well-being globally, if our hope is just for peace and well-being, then we're probably not going to achieve that, because there's always uncertainties and ructions, and the future is never guaranteed. But if we can acknowledge that economically, socially, politically, globally, there are uncertainties ahead, but we need to base our lives on something more trustworthy and more secure than the shifting sands of our era, well, then that gives the church a real message. And that's what this is, that there's a hope that's not just temporal but eternal, that there's answers beyond our own existence and perceptions, and that there's a rock of Christ on which we can base our life that doesn't shift and change with the ever-present trends. And so I think this is the message of the church, and this is the clear need for our society to point to something a bit more stable in their own experience and their own efforts.
Just hearing you talk about that makes me excited about sharing that hope which we have. And as we think about sharing that hope, I think Christians sometimes in Western Christianity can fall into the trap of thinking that the rest of Australia despises Christianity and will reject any notion of Jesus or anything spiritual. But is that actually true?
No, it's not. We definitely hear from those who have no religion and indeed are not spiritual, and they sort of push back on any effort to express or validate a life of faith. But firstly, 9 in 10 Australians either identify with a religion or they say they're not religious, but they're spiritual. So a metaphysical worldview is the vast dominance in Australia. If we focus the circle a little bit more, we know from the recent census 44% of Australians said their worldview, their faith, is actually Christianity. And if we even tighten it up further, we found that just over 1 in 3 Australians say that they call themselves Christians. A little more than that, as I said, 44% say Christianity is their religion. But to personalise that and say, I am a Christian, we're now at 1 in 3 of the population. Whatever that may mean for them, that's still a pretty significant identification to have. And then if you tighten that even further, around half of all of those who say, I call myself a Christian, will attend church or mass, a church service at least once a month. And so that's pretty significant numbers. There's not too many institutions in society that'll, over a 4-week period, gain 15% of the entire population passing through its doors. But that's what we have with the church in Australia. And as for those who aren't church attendees, may not even call themselves Christians, what's their sense on the church? Well, 3 in 4 Australians are either very warm or at least supportive of the church's rights and freedoms. There's about a quarter that have issues with Christianity, that will push back on Christianity or say, hey, I've got strong reservations about Christianity. And they're probably the ones that maybe we hear from a little bit, that are quite vocal on church and Christianity and people of faith, and maybe question the particular worldview of Christianity. But for 3 in 4 Australians, they're largely warm and supportive, or at least say, hey, Christians should have the freedoms like anyone else. So we are operating in times of warm terrain and broad support, even though we might think that the church is on the outer, that Christianity is on the wane, and that anyone who says I'm a person of faith is questioned. That's not the mainstream trend in Australia.
Yeah, so if I was to, say, invite someone to a church service on Sunday, I'm not going to get shunned or anything like that, probably.
Well, in fact, the opposite. We actually ran research of this, and we sampled Australians. So they're right across that. There are some that are warm towards Christianity, might even identify with it, others that are not. 30% in the census said, I have no religion. So there's still a good proportion of the population that aren't into religious things. But if you take a broad sample of Australians, as we did, and say, hey, if a friend or family member was to invite you to church or a Christian event, how likely is it for you to attend? And 1 in 3 said extremely or very likely. So that's, if we've got a connection with someone, their family or friend, we hand out 3 tickets or 3 invitations. One of them is extremely or very likely to be there. Now, you've got a second out of the 3 who said, yeah, I'd consider it. Okay, well, let's say they might not follow through. At least 1 out of the 3 invitations will. That's pretty good going. And when we filtered down by Generation Z, so that's those in their older teens and early 20s, they were much more likely to say so. It was just under half said they would be extremely or very likely to attend. So for young people, give out 2 invitations, you're likely to get one of those turn up. The problem is not that people aren't coming, it's that they're not being invited. That's the situation in Australia.
Wow, what a message. That's a great hit rate.
It is.
So, Mark, what are the sort of things that cause people to reject Christianity, or that are just belief blockers for people?
Well, firstly, it's hypocrisy. Australians, probably particularly those in the middle and older age groups, have had a bit of a history of maybe the church having more dominance, maybe religious leaders having more of a platform in society, and maybe back in the day things were a little bit more authoritarian with the institution of the church, and people felt perhaps a bit judged. Maybe it was their personal experience or the sort of church they were part of, and so there is a sense that, particularly reflecting on the last decade, where there's been various scandals, issues, problems, historic challenges, great problems with the church that have been revealed. And I guess piecing those two together, people say, well, there's a bit of Bible bashing on me growing up, but hey, look at what the church is on about. And so hypocrisy comes through. Now, there's a bit of hypocrisy of those outside of the church as well. So I think it's not unique to Christians. In fact, the true message of Christianity is, hey, we're not perfect. In fact, the opposite. We're saved by grace. And so maybe the message that was communicated or how it was understood was about living a perfect life, which is the opposite message to what we're about as followers of Christ. But nonetheless, that comes through, and we've got to make sure that we walk with integrity as Christians and live in that grace and show and share that grace to others. But that's the first one. The second is authoritarianism. So, and that's that shadow of the past as well, that maybe the church sort of wagged their finger a little bit. And Aussies have always been anti-authority, and particularly religious authorities. They don't take too well with being told what to do. Again, that's not the approach of the church that we would all be part of and know, but that's nonetheless the experience of Australians. And the third challenge is this sense of I just won't belong. It's just an institution, or I drive past all the churches, but I just don't feel that it's for me. So a sense of there's an exclusivity to the church and I'm not there. Now, again, that's the opposite. We're all about inviting and the open door and welcoming, and we try to say, hey, here's the Bible, here's an app, here's a book, have a read. Far from sort of being exclusive, and if you don't look like us, you're not welcome. It's the opposite message. But nonetheless, that's the perception that Australians have. So this sense of hypocrisy, authority, and exclusivity when we try to be the exact opposite. And I think if we can, walk humbly and with this sense of grace and this welcome, and be the invitational type church based on the warm response we'll likely receive, it's the exact antidote to those issues or perceptions that Australians have.
Yeah, so those are the sort of things that can help attract or help people see the hope of Jesus. What are those things on the positive side?
Well, when we asked Australians, what do you think about Christianity? When they were thinking about the institutional church, and again, some of those experiences, they were like, I'm not sure if that's for me. But when we said, what about the local church in your area, churches that you see, what do you think of that? And 8 in 10 Australians said they were warm towards the church. In other words, they see them doing great things, meeting the needs of their community, having impacts in the local area, and being a place of welcome and support for those who are part of that church. So there's warmth towards the local churches. There's engagement with Christianity, as we said, with almost half saying that's the faith they identify with. And there's even above that, great and good and positive perceptions of Jesus himself. So, all warm terrain in which we're operating rather than the hard soil that we sometimes think is there. But I think if we can model that well and be warm in our own interactions, it'll really help bridge some of those gaps.
So, Mark, taking a step back and taking a 40-foot view, 4,000, anyway, you get what I mean. As an Anglican church in Australia, as we seek to proclaim this hope of Jesus that we do have, should we be hopeful of a good reception, and why or why not?
We definitely should, because what we're about is being invitational, is being welcoming, is simply saying, I don't have all the answers. I don't know if I can answer all those tricky questions. I'm not perhaps an apologist, we might say, to friends that are asking hard questions. But I tell you what, just come and see and have a listen and see how it resonates with you. We found that when we asked people who have responded to the message of Christianity, what was it that was most influential to you? It was, number one, it was hearing stories of people who've been changed by their faith, because that's what Australians want. What they're doing isn't working. They're trying different things. They're doing their best. They're working hard, and they're still struggling, falling behind, feeling anxious, and with no certainty in the future. And when someone comes along and says, "I can relate. I was struggling myself. I was feeling the guilt. I was in a muddle. I was sort of spinning my wheels." I tell you what. There's this book I read called the Bible, or there's this message of Jesus I heard, and he's changed my life. That's impactful. I mean, that's the influence. That's the word of mouth referral that Australians respond to, and none more powerful than when it's a friend that we've seen changed. And the second thing that people respond to is that warm invitation where they say, "Look, I don't have all the answers, but let me share with you what's worked in my life." So those testimonies, those welcomes, those opportunities to come and hear for themselves is very warm. It's not as likely that Australians will respond to a strong apologetical argument to debate things out. They find that that's divisive, and a lot of Australians already think that religions can divide and it causes conflict. Sometimes we're not all equipped to give a theological exposition of a particular passage, and that might be a bit heavy for others anyway. But if they come and explore what Christianity is about, often through our own testimony, through someone that they know, and maybe we take them to a church service or Christian event where they can hear more and see that, well, it's not just some small little thing. There's lots of people gathered here, and they're hearing messages that maybe could impact my life as well. That's when they start to respond in a very positive way.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us. It's been so encouraging for me, and I hope so encouraging for others. Thank you so much for your help to help us see.
Great delight, Michael. Thanks for the chat.